Hello there, and welcome to my channel. If this is your first time, welcome. I hope you will enjoy the video currently showing, and please leave your comments below after viewing. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe to my channel, for there will be more videos to come. And thank you for your interest. Welcome to Bamburgh village, in Northumberland, England. Bamburgh's impregnable stronghold. The village of Bamburgh is dominated by its great sandstone castle, which stands on a massive windsill outcrop overlooking a beautiful beach and the Farne Islands out at sea. When viewed from the western end of the beach, near the Hackcross Rocks, the castle in its lofty coastal setting envisages days gone by, as well as often being used as a setting for historic scenes in Hollywood movies. The building is well described in William Tomlinson's Guide to Northumberland. A more impregnable stronghold could not be imagined, for rugged strength and barbaric grandeur it is the king of Northumbrian castles. From nearly every point of the compass its majestic outlines are visible. There is evidence of human activity in and around Bamburgh, from the Mesolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age eras, as well as the Iron Age. Perhaps occupied by the Romans, in pre-Anglo-Saxon times, Bamburgh was called Dinguer, or Dingueri, and was a tribal stronghold of an ancient British tribe of the Iron Age, called the Vitadini. The Vitadini were friendly to the Romans and made peace with them, being an important provider of grain to the Romans in the north. Dingueroi, the old name for Bamburgh, inspired speculation that Bamburgh was once the legendary Joyous Garde, the castle of Sir Lancelot in the legends of King Arthur. Bamburgh, Northumbria. Bamburgh's recorded history begins in 547 AD, when King Aidan, an invading Angle chief, established the royal city and capital of Bernishire at Bamburgh. Bernishire was an expanding kingdom, probably centered upon the rivers Tyne and Wear. King Aidan's people were Angles, a fierce piratical race, originating from a region now lost amongst the borders of Germany and Denmark. As Bernishire expanded, it conquered the ancient Celtic-speaking tribes of the region, including the Kingdom of Ridged, in what is now Cumbria. The rise of Bernishire reached a climax in 603 AD, when King Athelfrith of Bernishire, who was the grandson of Aidan, seized control of the neighbouring Angle kingdom of Darragh, in Yorkshire. This resulted in the formation of a new powerful kingdom called Northumbria, stretching from the River Humber northwards. The name Bamburgh originates from the time of Athelfrith, who named the fortress or burg after his wife and Queen Bebba. Over the years the name Bebba's was simplified to Bamburgh. Before Athelfrith's time, Bamburgh had continued to be known by its Celtic British name Dinguer, or Dingueri. One of the most powerful Northumbrian kings associated with Bamburgh was King Oswald, from 634 to 642 AD, was a pagan who converted to Christianity and appointed Saint Aidan as the first bishop of nearby Lindisfarne, making this northeastern corner of Northumbria an important focal point for early Christian cultural developments. Northumbria, which occupied almost a third of the whole British mainland, had become at the height of its influence one of the strongest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain, and was ruled from two capitals at York and Bamburgh. Archaeological excavations at an Anglo-Saxon cemetery just outside Bamburgh Castle have revealed that the Northumbrian capital at Bamburgh was a cosmopolitan community during the time of King Oswald. Bioarchaeologists, who have studied the cemetery, have found that the high-status burials on this pre-Viking Age site show individuals originated from a variety of places across Europe, including the Hebrides, Scandinavian countries and the southern Mediterranean, and even North Africa. Around 110 burials from the cemetery site were reburied in a crypt or an ossuary at Bamburgh's Church of St. Aidan in 2016 in a special ceremony. Other finds discovered over years of continuing archaeological excavations in and around Bamburgh have revealed hundreds of Anglo-Saxon coins, an Anglo-Saxon sword found in 1960, and a tiny 7th century solid gold plaque featuring a zoomorphological design. The last mentioned of these, found in 1971, is known as the Beast of Bamburgh. Believed to be from a book cover or a shrine, it is now used as the official emblem of Bamburgh Castle. Although for a time the supremacy of the Northumbrian kings was challenged by the Great Midland Kingdom of Mercia, and on 2 occasions, the castle was attacked by the Mercian king Penda, Bamburgh remained an important Anglo-Saxon centre. The north of Northumbria focused on Bamburgh, Chester-le Street and later on Durham, which remained a fiercely independent Anglo-Saxon province, right up until the time of the Norman conquest. In later times, the Viking Kingdom of York had challenged Bamburgh's supremacy, and the fortress was a target for the Danes on more than one occasion, falling victim to the raiders in the year 993 AD. Bamburgh in Norman times. After 1066, the old communal fortress and citadel of the Northumbrians became a private baronial fortress of the Norman conquerors, though the independently minded outlook of the province, which seems to have rubbed off on the third Norman-appointed Earl of Northumbria, Robert de Mowbray, who revolted against King William Rufus in 1095. Mowbray's castle at Tynemouth was captured by the king, but Mowbray took refuge at Bamburgh, another of his possessions, which the king's forces found impregnable. An Evil Neighbour fort was built in close proximity to Bamburgh, which was heavily garrisoned with the king's men, whose intention was to besiege Bamburgh by starving Mowbray out. After some time, Mowbray attempted to make his escape, although during his attempt, he was captured following a skirmish. However, the castle remained in the hands of Mowbray's wife and his nephew Arkell Morel. It was Morel who had played a big part through trickery in the defeat and death of King Malcolm of Scotland at Alnwick in 1093. The captured Mowbray was taken to Bamburgh, where the king's forces threatened to have Mowbray's eyes gouged out. Mowbray's family and the retainers surrendered Bamburgh to the forces of the king. Mowbray was imprisoned at Windsor, but later pardoned and is thought to have retired as a monk at St. Albans Priory. A kingdom within the walls. Despite its obvious grandeur, Bamburgh was by no means the most important border fortress in the later medieval era, with castles like Norham, and certainly Alnwick being of greater significance. Part of Bamburgh became the site of a monastic foundation around 1121, and the ruins of a chapel within the castle may be associated with this. The chapel is thought to have been built on the site of an earlier Anglo-Saxon chapel, within the fortress, which is thought to have retained the holy remains of King Oswald. Nevertheless, Bamburgh still proved a very useful fortress. And as a royal castle which played host to King John, Henry II, Edward I, Edward II and Edward III, as well as Harry Hotspur, who was the 14th century son of the Earl of Northumbria who commanded the castle. The castle often served the purpose of a prison during medieval times, and its distinguished guests in this respect included Piers Gaveston, the much despised favourite of King Edward II, and also King David II, who was captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross, near Durham City in 1346. One curious event in Bamburgh's history took place at the time of the Wars of the Roses, when Bamburgh Castle, along with Dunstanburgh and Alnwick, was a staunchly Lancastrian stronghold. It was here in 1464 that King Henry VI, along with his wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou, fled following a defeat by the Yorkists in a battle at Hexham. For a short time the disheartened monarch held court at Bamburgh, during which time the great building encompassed the total extent of his kingdom. Eventually Henry was defeated when Bamburgh came under siege from the artillery of Edward IV under the powerful Richard Neville, who was at that time the Earl of Warwick, and was also known as Warwick the Kingmaker. Heavy artillery was used in the siege, and Bamburgh became the first castle in England to fall to cannon fire. Interestingly, present at this siege was Sir Thomas Malory, who added much of the substance to the legend of King Arthur, and created the idea that Bamburgh may be associated with Sir Lancelot's castle of Joyous Gard. Lord Crewe's Castle. The massive keep of the castle dates to the 12th century with dimensions of 61 feet by 69 feet and a height of 35 feet. Much of the outer walls of the castle are medieval, and some parts of the towers are Norman, yet the building was in considerable ruin when it was purchased by Nathaniel Lord Crewe, the Bishop of Durham, in 1704, from the bankrupt Forster family who then owned it. Crewe also bought the estate of Blanchland from the family, which lies in the Derwent Valley in the southern reaches of Northumberland near the border with County Durham. Both the villages of Bamburgh and Blanchland are incidentally homes to handsome stone inns, called the Lord Crewe. The Forsters had been constables of Bamburgh since the reign of Elizabeth I. Bishop Crewe was married to Dorothy, a member of this family who was heir to the castle, along with her nephew Tom Forster. Crewe settled Tom's debts by purchasing the castle. Tom, who was a member of Parliament for Northumberland, as his father was before him, became heavily involved in the Jacobite Rebellion of 1715 and was its most prominent leader. He supported the claims of James Stuart, the old pretender to the throne. Seemingly the whole of Northumberland came out in support, but the people of Newcastle refused to back him. This was because they supported King George, which is said to be the origin of the term Geordie. The rebellion was a failure. Forster was captured and imprisoned at Newgate in London. Whilst imprisoned there, he was rescued by his sister, who, like his aunt, was also called Dorothy. She disguised her brother as her maid. Dorothy, who later became the eponymous subject of the novel Dorothy Forster by Sir Walter Besant. Tom Forster fled to the continent where he continued to plot against the crown. He would not return to England until after his death, for burial at Bamburgh. On the death of Lord Crewe, Bamburgh Castle passed to Crewe's charitable trust, and after 1757, as part of the castle keep, it became the home to a girls' school, later an infirmary, and then accommodation for shipwrecked sailors. Much of the adaptation of the castle at this time was in line with the wishes of Crewe's trust, and was undertaken by a Crewe trustee called John Sharp, who was Archdeacon of Northumberland. A further development of the trust's activities under Sharp was the establishment of what was claimed to be the world's oldest lifeboat station. The station utilized a converted cobble which was adapted for the task of sea rescues. Another development of the castle at this time, and in line with the wishes of the trust, was the establishment of a granary at the castle for the use of the villagers. A vestige of this is the Bamburgh Castle windmill. Sadly, there are no longer sails at the west end of the castle. The mill, though, was built by John Sharp as part of the granary. Corn was bought in and ground on site, where it was sold to local people at reasonable rates. The mill currently is positioned on the site of an earlier tower that was part of the castle. It stands near the site of the ancient gateway to the castle called St. Oswald's Gate, with roots going back to Anglo-Saxon times. It was once the only entrance to the fortress. Armstrong's Castle. In 1894, Bamburgh was purchased by the Tyneside industrialist William Lord Armstrong, who lived at Cragside House near Rothbury. During Armstrong's period of ownership, the castle underwent significant restoration and rebuilding under the guidance of the architect, called Charles Fergusson. Fergusson's designs initially allowed for the inclusion of a convalescent home in line with the charitable wishes of Bishop Crewe, but this was relocated to Bamburgh village. However, Armstrong and his architect must take significant credit for the wonderful edifice that we see today, whilst the Armstrong family descendants continue to maintain the castle for the enjoyment of the visitors today. Today, the modern visitor can explore a number of rooms within the castle and enjoy the mix of medieval and Victorian splendor. There is an extraordinary range of beautiful items and artifacts, including 18th and 19th century portraits, porcelain, landscape paintings, silver, furnishings, fabrics, tapestries, a wonderful hammerbeam roof, stained glass, armor, with many more things to see. The Bamburgh Village. The beautiful village of Bamburgh offers some of the most delightful views of the castle, to the north of its extensive cricket green, which the castle overlooks on its lofty dark grey windsill cliffs. Bamburgh is a small village with 2 or 3 main streets and numerous cottages, some of which serve as holiday homes and bed and breakfast establishments, as well as inns and coffee shops. The village retains much charm, and is much less commercial than the larger seaside village of Sea Houses to the south. The castle itself is approached by a driveway at the east end of the village, while the beautiful Bamburgh beach and its spectacular views of the castle can be reached from a pathway at the west end of the green near the castle windmill, which takes you through the sandy grassy dunes down to the shore. The pubs and coffee shops are clustered along Front Street, which has a number of 18th century cottages. Here we get the best views that combine both castle and village. Near the Lord Crew Hotel, there is a tiny triangular village green, where the road continues past the castle, and passing its car park which leads to the castle's entrance driveway, before continuing to sea houses, this being the main route for visitors in and out of Bamburgh, which offers great views of the neighbouring dunes and the distant Farne Islands. The Farne Islands. The Farnes consist of almost 30 islands which are visible at high tide, and many others visible at low tide. Some of the islands have wonderful names, like Megstone, Elbow, Widepans, Goldstone, The Bush, Boreham Shad, Gun Rock, Staple Island Brownsman, Callers Crumstone Fang, North and South Wamses, Rodman Green, Big and Little Harker, Nameless Rock, Blue Caps, Longstone, and the furthest out at 4.5 miles from the shore is Neverstone. The Farne Islands are formed by the most seaward outcrops of the volcanic intrusion, called the Great Wind Sill. This sill can be traced from Upper Teesdale in County Durham, where it forms, amongst other features, is the High Force waterfall. It can then be traced across other areas of Western Durham, re-emerging in spectacular fashion in Northumberland, creating the impressive crags that provide the setting for the most visually stunning sections of Hadrian's Wall. On the North Northumberland coast, a continuation of the same intrusion creates the Farne Islands, and the rocks upon which sit the castles of Lindisfarne, Bamburgh and Dunstanburgh. The rock gives the Farne Islands their distinctive blackened appearance. The Bamburgh Village. Near the Little Green, another street called the Winding, which is a cul-de-sac that also joins the front street from the north, and is the most secluded of Bamburgh's main streets with alternative views of the castle at its north end. The other main street is Church Street, the road to Belford in the Aidan. About 1.5 miles east of Bamburgh, it passes close to Budle Bay, and the nearby settlement of Warren, which served as the medieval port for Bamburgh. Within Bamburgh itself, Church Street contains charming Tudoresque houses of the 19th century and passes the Grace Darling Museum on its south side. The museum commemorates the life of the famous Northumbrian heroine of that name, who made a famous sea rescue from the island of Longstone on the Farne Islands in 1838. Just over on the opposite north side of the road from the museum is the Church of St. Aidan, where there is a memorial to Grace in the churchyard. The church is mainly 13th century, though perhaps has a Norman foundation, and is said to have been built on a site of an earlier church which marked the spot where St. Aidan himself passed away in Anglo-Saxon times. Grace Darling. Grace Darling was born on the 24th of November 1815 at her grandfather's house in Northumberland. She was the 7th of 9 children, 4 brothers and 4 sisters born to William and Thomasin Darling, and when only a few weeks old, she was taken to live on Brownsman Island, one of the Farne Islands, in a small cottage attached to the lighthouse. Her father ran the lighthouse, which was built in 1795, for Trinity House, and earned a salary of £70 per year, equivalent to £5,500 in 2021, with a bonus of £10 for satisfactory service. The accommodation was basic, and the lighthouse was not located in a good place to guide shipping to safety. So in the year 1826, the family moved to the newly constructed lighthouse on Longstone Island. The Longstone Lighthouse had better accommodation, but the island itself was slightly less hospitable, so William would row back to Brownsman to gather vegetables from their former garden to feed the animals. The family spent most of their time on the ground floor of the lighthouse, which consisted of a large room and was heated by a wooden stove. The room was their living room and dining room, and kitchen in one, and had a spiral staircase leading to 3 bedrooms above, with the light at the top of the tower. In the early hours of the 7th of September 1838, Grace Darling was looking from an upstairs window when she spotted the wreck and the survivors of the Forfarshire on Big Harker, which is a nearby low rocky island. The Forfarshire had foundered on the rocks and broken in half. One of the halves had sunk during the night. Grace Darling and her father, William, determined that the weather was too rough for the lifeboat to put out from sea houses, instead took a rowing boat of 21 feet across to the survivors, taking a long route that kept to the left side of the islands, a distance of nearly a mile. Grace Darling kept the boat steady in the water, while her father helped 4 men and the lone surviving woman called Sarah Dawson into the boat. Although she survived to sinking, Mrs. Dawson had lost her 2 young children, James aged 7 and Matilda aged 5, during that fateful night. William and 3 of the rescued men then rowed the boat back to the lighthouse. Grace Darling then remained at the lighthouse, while William and 3 of the rescued crew members rowed back and recovered 4 more survivors. Meanwhile, the lifeboat had set out from sea houses, but arrived at Big Harker Rock after Darling and her father had completed their rescue operation. All they found were the bodies of Mrs. Dawson's children and that of a clergyman. Returning to the lighthouse to take shelter, Darling's brother, William Brooks Darling, was one of the 7 fishermen in the lifeboat. The weather deteriorated to the extent that everyone was obliged to remain at the lighthouse for 3 days before returning to shore. The Forfarshire had been carrying 62 people. The vessel broke in 2, almost immediately upon hitting the rocks. Those rescued by Darling and her father were from the bow section of the vessel, which had been held by the rocks for some time before sinking. All that remained at daybreak was the portside paddlebox casing, with 9 other passengers, whilst the crew had managed to float off on a lifeboat from the stern section before it, and were picked up in the night by a passing Montrose sloop and brought into South Shields that same night. As news of her role in the rescue reached the public, her combination of bravery and simple virtue set her out as exemplary, and led to an uneasy role as the nation's heroine. Grace and her father were awarded the Silver Medal for Bravery by the Royal National Institution for the Preservation of Life from Shipwrecks. It was later named the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. Subscriptions and donations totaling over £700 were raised for Grace Darling, including £50 from Queen Victoria. More than a dozen portrait painters sailed to her island home to capture her likeness, and hundreds of gifts, letters, and even marriage proposals were delivered to her. Her unexpected wealth and fame were such that the Duke of Northumberland took on a role as her self-appointed guardian and founder of a trust established to look after the donations offered to her. His personal gifts to her family and to Grace included a timepiece and a silver teapot. In 1842, Darling became poorly whilst visiting the mainland and was in convalescence with her cousins the Macfarlanes. In their house in Narrowgate, Darling's health declined, and in the final stages of her condition, she was conveyed to the place of her birth, in Bamburgh. She died of tuberculosis in October 1842, aged 26. She is buried in the churchyard of St. Aidan's Church in Bamburgh. St. Aidan's Church stands on the north side of Church Street, as it heads away from the centre of Bamburgh towards Belford. It is fairly unmissable in its own right, but for anyone needing further directions, it stands almost opposite the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, Grace Darling Museum. The church enjoys a superb location offering broad sea views, and equally good views of Bamburgh Castle, with whose story is closely entwined. From the outside, St. Aidan's church can appear slightly oddly proportioned. The nave has a lower roof line than the chancel, and the chancel is also unusually long when compared to the length of the nave. There is no doubt whatsoever that the chancel was regarded by its builders as the most important part of the church. The interior of the church is wonderful, but it is worth first taking a stroll around the churchyard. The west side of this is dominated by the very grand memorial to Grace Darling, whose story is explored in this video about Bamburgh. The memorial was intended to be large enough to be seen by passing mariners out at sea, and it probably succeeds. The memorial you see today was erected in 1895. An earlier memorial was erected in 1844, 2 years after Grace Darling's death, was badly damaged in a storm during 1885. The reclining statue of Grace used on the original memorial was given a more sheltered home in the north aisle of the church. Meanwhile, the gravestone marking the burial place of Grace Darling, her parents and her brother and sister, can be found a short distance south of the memorial. While in the graveyard, it is worth looking out for a gravestone near the main entrance to the church bearing a skull and crossbones. This is referred to as a pirate's grave. It seems more likely to have been the grave of a Scot. Such symbols of mortality were common on post-Reformation Scottish gravestones in an era in which the symbol of the cross was seen as unduly papist. But realizing that the founder of the church died here, not far short of 14 centuries ago, this really brings home just how ancient the story of the church actually is. Christianity had briefly gained a foothold in Northumbria in the year 620, but it really flourished after the accession to the crown of King Oswald of Northumbria, who later became Saint Oswald in 634. He spent much of his youth in what is now called Argyll, and had converted to the distinctive brand of Celtic Christianity, which had taken root there after initial development in Ireland. Oswald wanted his subjects to share his religion, and asked the centre of the Celtic Church, the monastery on Aidan, to provide a suitable bishop to oversee the conversion of Northumbria. The man they sent to serve as bishop was called Aidan, who had later become Saint Aidan and from 635 spent 17 years in Northumbria, working alongside monks that came over with him from Aidan to establish a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, which was granted by King Oswald. You can tell a lot about a church from the feeling it gives you as you enter. St. Aidan's church conveys a sense of great serenity and of great antiquity. On passing through the door, you find yourself in the broad south aisle, beyond which is the nave and the rather narrower north aisle. An unusually small chancel arch gives access to the unusually large chancel, which is a result that feels quite separate from the nave. The focal point of the church is, of course, at the east end of the chancel, where you find the high altar. There is also a nave altar at the east end of the nave, and the magnificent carved reredos. Close by is the reclining effigy of a knight thought to date from about 1325. Also within the chancel is a memorial marking the spot where St. Aidan died in 651. to this point we have been exploring a church, whose main standing components were built in the decades either side of the 12th century, the chancel, the tower, and parts of the nave. Then in the 1300s, the transepts and the south aisle, and in the 1400s, the north aisle. Aidan also built a wooden church in Oswald's capital, called Bamburgh, and this is believed to have stood on the site of the chancel of the later church. By the 11th century, this early wooden church had probably been replaced in stone. The income from St. Aidan's Church was awarded in 1121 by King Henry I to the Augustinian canons of Nostell Priory in Yorkshire. This led to some conflict with the Bishop of Durham, who felt he had a claim to the church, but this seems to have been resolved by 1170, when work began to completely rebuild whatever had stood there before. The work on rebuilding the church seems to have continued until about 1230. After the Reformation, St. Aidan's continued as a parish church, though it seems to have been in a poor state of repair by the 1600s. It was subsequently restored, and in the centuries since, have seen fairly frequent rounds of repair, usually funded by the notable families who have resided in Bamburgh Castle, especially the Forsters family. The last major round of restoration took place in 1895, which left the church very much as you see it today. Budle Bay and Warren Mill. Along the coast just northwest of Bamburgh is the lovely estuarine tidal inlet of Budle Bay. It's a beautiful bay that completely floods at high tide. When the tide retreats, it leaves behind extensive mud flats and the estuary of a tidal creek called Budle Water. Forming part of the Lindisfarne Nature Reserve, Budle Bay is noted for its migrant waterfowl, and is especially popular with birdwatchers in wintertime. The bay is beautiful to look at, but it is dangerous to cross, even when the tide has just departed, causing many lives to be lost over the years. Budle Water, which enters the sea here, is formed by the merging of streams called Ross Low from the north side, and the Warren Burn from the south side, which join together within the mudflats of the bay. Warren Burn was known in the past as the River Warne, which is a Celtic river name meaning older river, that enters the bay at the hamlet of Warren Mill, close to the site of a medieval port called Warnemouth. Once a busy medieval port, the harbour at Warnemouth has silted up over the centuries. It is thought that the Anglo-Saxon kings of Northumbria may have once had a port here. The name Budle derives from an Anglo-Saxon word, meaning dwelling, that occurs in other northeast place names in different forms such as Walbottle, Newbottle, and Bothell. We know for sure that in the 13th century, King Henry III chartered a port and borough at Warnemouth that served Bamburgh. There was a corn mill at Warnemouth as early as the 1180s, and later a mill from the 1780s. These days, there are now houses and apartments overlooking the bay. Following the Warren Burn upstream, the valley passes the crags of Spindlestone Hews on its east side. Close to here, we find the Laidley Worm's Trough, which is the setting for the legend of the Laidley Worm, one of those worm legends for which the northeast of England is particularly renowned. Village of Lacca. Further along the Wear-and-Burn Valley, we pass the little village of Bradford, named from a broad ford that must have once crossed the burn. Here the peat land of the neighbouring Bradford Kames to the east was once an ancient wetland. Archaeological evidence has shown this wetland was once crossed by boards in ancient times, with evidence showing the presence of man, going back 6,200 years ago. The wetland seemingly extended to the village of Lucca, further along the Wear-and-Burn Valley to the south. Its name derives from the Scandinavian locia, meaning marsh frequented by sandpipers. Roman coins contained in a small oak box was found buried in a peat bog during the 19th century. Lucca is home to a holiday park with static caravans, lodges and a spa. Where Lucca Hall encompasses several luxury holiday cottages is a modern development. The 18th century hall was destroyed in a fire during the 1980s. A hall was first mentioned in 1316, and a medieval village was excavated by archaeologists prior to the building of the new development. To the west of the A1, the Wear-and-Burn Valley divides into two streams at a place called Twisel. The name means fork, and these streams rise on the extensive Chatton and Lucca moors. Other streams to the west of these moors feed the River Till. Belford. Known in Anglo-Saxon times as Bellenford, which was thought to have been the site of a ford belonging to someone called Bella, presumably on a crossing of the Belford Burn. Today, however, Belford is a little town situated off the A1 road, about 3 miles northwest of Lucca, and 2 miles inland from Budle Bay, now bypassed by the busy A1 road, which was formerly an important coaching stop on the famous Great North Road, from London to Edinburgh. Belford is a quiet place, though it will have seen much in the way of comings and goings in times past, and in medieval times was often a target for Scottish raids. Belford's fortified moated house, or the castle called the Castrum de Belford, in the 15th century is now Westfall Farm to the west of the town, where there are still traces of a moat. Old streets of Belford are the High Street, West Street, Church Street and the Nuke, which are focused upon the old marketplace. Here is the Bluebell Inn, which is Belford's best-known landmark, and was a former coaching inn on the Great North Road. Belford would have been a large village, rather than a town, if it were not for the little marketplace and its market cross. Rebuilding and restoration of the 19th century. To the east of Belford is the Palladian-style Belford Hall, now residential apartments in a parkland setting. Dating from 1752, it was built by the architect James Payne for the Dixon family, who acquired the manor in 1726. Later additions were made to the hall by John Dobson in the 19th century, who was also involved with the redevelopments at Belford Church. To the south and southwest of Belford are Belford Moor, Chatton Moor, Linham Moor, and the village of Chatton in the Till Valley, towards Wooler. To the northeast are extensive moorlands that are heavily wooded, in places stretching north to the Kyloe Hills, and south of Beal and Lowick. From the Kyloe Hills, which are derived from Kylor or the Hill of the Cows, north of Belford, down to Spindlestone Crag, near Budle Bay. To the east of the town there are extensive outcrops of the distinctive Great Windsill. Another interesting feature in the moors of the Kylor Hills, to the west of Belford, is the curious St. Cuthbert's Cave, also known as a cove. Located near the hamlets of North Hazelrigg and Holborn, it is said to have been a retreat for the famed Northumbrian saint. This sandstone cave, with its overhanging rocks and attractive surrounding woodlands, are under the ownership of the National Trust, who provide a car park at Holborn Grange. From here you can walk to St. Cuthbert's Cave. The cave is one of two sandstone caves, known as St. Cuthbert's Cave in Northumberland. The other is situated on Doddington Moor, near Wooler. The long-distance footpath called St. Cuthbert's Way passes through the St. Cuthbert's Cave area, near Holborn. It is 62 miles long and ends at Holy Island, passing through Fenwick on the mainland, from where it continues to St. Cuthbert's Cave, and then onward to Wooler, then Helpool in the College Valley, before crossing the border to Town Yetholm, and onward to Melrose in the Scottish borders. Melrose was a place which, like Lindisfarne, had close links to St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert's Way crosses the road north from Chatton near South Hazelrigg, about 1.5 miles south of St. Cuthbert's Cave, as it makes its way west towards Wooler. By the roadside there is a wooden statue of St. Cuthbert, by Tom Fiddis, and there is a pleasing view southwest, towards the Cheviots. The legend of the Laidley worm of Bamburgh. Bamburgh is the setting for one of the curious worm legends, which seem to be a regular feature of northeastern folklore. The story is that in ancient times, the jealous stepmother of a Bamburgh princess turned the young maiden into a Laidley, or loathsome worm, who began to terrorize the neighborhood of Bamburgh and Budle Bay. For 7 miles east, and 7 miles west, and 7 miles north and south, no blade of grass or corn would grow, so deadly was her mouth. The milk of 7 streaked cows, it was their cost to keep. They brought her daily, which she drank before she went to sleep. At this day might be seen the cave where she lay folded up, and the trough o' stone, the very same, out of which she supped. The princess's brother, upon hearing of the activities of this terrible beast, returned to England from business abroad in the expected tradition, to deal with the serpent. The creature greeted the prince's ship, at Budle Bay near Bamburgh, with the following well-chosen verses. "O quit thy sword, unbend thy brow, and give me kisses 3. For though I'm a poisonous worm, no hurt I'll do to thee. O quit thy sword, unbend thy brow, and give me kisses 3. If I'm not one here, the sun goes down, one shall I never be." So, he quitted his sword and smoothed his brow, and gave her kisses 3. She crept into the hole a worm, and came out a fair lady. When the prince confronted the stepmother to whose magic powers he was immune, she desperately pleaded for his forgiveness. Showing no mercy, the prince responded with revengeful anger, and then turned his stepmother into a loathsome toad. The ballad concludes, "And on the lands near Ida's towers, a loathsome toad she crawls, and venom spits on everything, which cometh to the walls." The ballad of the Laidley worm has similarities with the Lambton and Sopwin worm legends of County Durham, but probably is not of their antiquity. It is said to have been written by a Cheviot mountain bard in the 13th century, but evidence suggests that the true author was a vicar of Norham-on-Tweed, who lived many centuries later. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe to my channel. I hope you will come back again, as more videos will be uploaded soon. And thank you for your interest.